Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar will provide an overview of the Accountability Framework Initiative as part of the current public consultation process being conducted on the draft Accountability Framework. My name is Jeff Milder. I'm the Director of Global Programs at Rainforest Alliance, and I lead the Secretariat for the Accountability Framework Initiative. I'm joined here today and presenting by Akiva Fishman, the Senior Program Officer with the Forest Team at WWF US. And Akiva also represents WWF in the Accountability Framework Initiative. The two of us are presenting today on behalf of a coalition of 15 NGOs and civil society partners that together make up the Accountability Framework Initiative, or the AFI. So this is a diverse coalition, including an array of social and environmental NGOs working around the world, representing multiple countries and perspectives. During today's webinar, Akiva and I will be presenting an overview and update on the AFI, and we'll then spend the bulk of the time providing a summary of the contents and application of the draft Accountability Framework. Excuse me, just a minute. I want to make sure. Akiva, Adrian, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Give me just a sec here because
okay. It looks like Akiva
a message
might not be able to. All right, thanks. I'll carry on while you make sure that.
Okay, I think we're started now. Sorry, that was just a slight technology issue. I think we're good to go. Can everyone hear us now? Akiva, can you hear us?
Adrian, unfortunately, they can't respond because they are all muted. So you need to ask them to either raise their hand or whatnot if you want to know if they see.
Akiva says that he can hear us now.
Yes,
okay.
I can now hear you.
Oh, there you go.
I hear you too, Akiva. Thanks. All right, carry on, Jeff. Sorry.
Great. Good day, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm going to back up and start again here now that we are recording the webinar. This webinar is meant to provide an overview of the Accountability Framework Initiative as part of the current public consultation process that we're conducting on the draft framework. My name is Jeff Milder. I'm the Director of Global Programs at Rainforest Alliance, and I lead the Accountability Framework Initiative Secretariat. And I'm joined here today by Akiva Fishman, Senior Program Officer with the Forest Team at WWF US, and representing WWF within the Accountability Framework Initiative, the AFI. Akiva and I are presenting today on behalf of the full coalition behind the AFI. That includes 15 NGOs and civil society partners, including a diverse array of groups working on both environmental and human rights topics, representing 6 countries around the world with offices and staff in many more countries. So it's a broad coalition here, and we're here to share with you the progress we've made on the framework and to seek your feedback. We'll begin the presentation today with an overview and update on the AFI, and then focus the bulk of the time actually sharing the draft framework to give a sense of what's in the framework, and also to help participants understand where they can go to read the documents and if they'd like to comment during the present consultation period, which continues through March 4th. We'll then have about 15 or 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers and discussion. We are very glad that we had about 200 people from around the world register for this webinar, so we're very happy that there's interest in the accountability framework, and
Hi, Jeff. I think we lost you there. There we go. We can hear you again.
Great. I also would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the AFI website subsequently. So if you'd like to share it with any colleagues, feel free to do so. With no further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Akiva, who will provide an initial overview and update on the AFI.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So the good news, as you all know, is that we are seeing more sustainability commitments than ever in critical forest risk commodity sectors, with almost 500 companies making almost 800 different forest-related commitments. And there are lots of caveats about insufficient commitment coverage for certain key commodities and about gaps in supply chains, but the rising number of overall commitments is definitely a good thing and has elevated attention to the deforestation problem. And company commitments are bolstered by international agreements like the New York Declaration on Forests and the SDGs, which have set targets for ending deforestation globally. So although more and more companies are reporting their exposure to forest risk commodities, disclosing and reporting their production or sourcing data, we can see that progress is still lagging. The 2018 report by colleagues from TFA, CDP, Climate Focus, and the Prince of Wales International Sustainability Unit shows, for example, that many companies fail to extend their no deforestation commitments beyond forests to other natural ecosystems, and others don't extend their commitments to all their forest risk supply chains. And fewer than half of companies can trace implementation of their commitments beyond their direct suppliers, and companies are using different definitions for key terminology. And then there's also a lack of consistency in what is reported, with many companies relying on self-reporting and lacking information on sourcing geographies. If you can go on to the next slide, please. Unfortunately, trends in tropical forest cover loss are still increasing, and 2/3 of this is due to commercial agriculture. So we can see clearly that there's a gap between what has been committed and action on the ground. And until we fill this gap, forests will continue to disappear, human rights violations will persist, and companies will continue to face material financial risk. Next, please. So AFI, the Accountability Framework Initiative, is a collaboration that's designed to accelerate progress and improve accountability toward meeting supply chain commitments to address loss of ecosystems and violations of human rights. The initiative's main output, the Accountability Framework, provides common definitions, norms, and guidance to cut through the confusion in implementing these commitments. In this way, it helps companies and other stakeholders by consolidating the best practices for setting, implementing, and reporting on commitments, for clarifying which of the existing tools can help meet these commitments, providing guidance where it is currently lacking, adding consistency to metrics for monitoring and making claims, and building consensus across civil society and the public and private sectors around what it means and what it takes to implement these supply chain commitments. Next, please. So I want to speak straight away to a couple of questions that often come up about what AFI is and isn't. First, it is intended to be widely used and referenced as a public good, so it is not a product or a service that can be purchased. It's also not a compliance standard or a certification program. Instead, it provides a common set of guidance for setting, implementing, and reporting on deforestation and conversion-free commitments. And relatedly, it will not assess or rate company performance on its own. Rather, it provides guidance on how performance should be assessed and is partnering to inform existing reporting and assessment initiatives. Next, please. In terms of scope, AFI is both narrow and expansive. It's narrow in the sense that it covers only the issues of eliminating deforestation and conversion of other natural ecosystems, respect for human rights, and support for local livelihoods. So it does not speak to all elements of a supply chain commitment that a company would need to address to achieve a full measure of responsibility, like issues of toxics, nutrient management, GHG emissions, or others. But AFI is also broad in the sense that its guidance applies to the supply chains for all commodities and in all geographies where commodities are produced. In this way, it mirrors the scopes of existing commitments relating to agricultural and forestry supply chains. Next, please. So AFI is led by a steering group, like Jeff mentioned, comprising 15 environmental and social NGOs and independent experts, and numerous other organizations have contributed to drafting the guidance materials. AFI is also aligning and collaborating with a range of other efforts in the deforestation and conversion-free space, including implementation protocols like the High Carbon Stock Approach and HCV, national and regional approaches like the Africa Palm Oil Initiative, reporting and assessment initiatives like CDP Forests, responsible investment initiatives, and certification systems. AFI has also been co-creating its guidance materials with stakeholders in each of the key tropical production regions through regional workshops, as well as with the private sector through engagement with industry associations, deep bilateral consultations with companies, and other modalities. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of the process we've gone through to arrive at the draft guidance we'll be going through with you today. In a nutshell, we are currently in the midst of the third and final public consultation of the guidance materials that began over a year ago with the high-level principles document that Jeff will describe in a minute. We elected to consult new materials as they were drafted rather than wait until all components were ready, recognizing that commitment deadlines are looming and that companies have been eager to seek guidance as soon as possible. We will be accepting inputs on the current round through March, including for many of you, I hope, and we're targeting May for launch of version 1 of the full accountability framework. The launch, important to mention, will include an online platform that will make it easy for users to access information in a variety of ways so they can quickly locate the guidance that addresses their needs. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff to talk about how the accountability framework can be used, and then we'll start walking through the content with you.
Great, thank you very much, Akiva. With that introduction and context having been said, now it's time to turn to the draft framework itself. And as Akiva mentioned, these weeks, these months are a critical moment for the AFI, where we've now completed a full draft of the framework and we're putting it out to stakeholders for input and consultation. So in the remainder of the webinar, we hope to provide everyone with a summary of what's in the framework. And hopefully, having heard that, you will be interested to look deeper into some of the materials, all of which are available on the AFI website, and also to provide your feedback, which also can be done online through the website. Before going into the specific details of the framework, it's helpful to understand how it is likely to be used, how it's meant to be used. A principal target user group is private companies working in the agriculture and forestry supply chains, all the way from primary producers and processors through to traders, manufacturers, retailers, as well as the finance sector that supports these sectors. We use the metaphor of a journey, of the ethical supply chain journey, to describe the stages that most companies follow as they first become aware of the materiality of social and environmental risk issues, and then take steps to address them. The stages on this journey include setting commitments, which could be the establishment of new commitments or the revision of existing commitments, taking action, both on the ground and in how supply chains are managed, and then monitoring and demonstrating progress. The framework is also intended to be used by other key stakeholders who support or enable this journey, including government, civil society, and others. And I'll highlight some of these additional uses as I go through the presentation. This slide presents the high-level structure and architecture of the accountability framework. And as you can see across the top there are the 3 stages in the journey: setting commitments, taking action, and demonstrating progress. And the framework is organized in 2 tiers or 2 levels of detail. The highest level is the core principles, which provide a summary of each of these elements. The core principles is 12 pages long, so it's easy to read in one sitting and get the gist of everything that's in the framework. And you can see in the top tier on the slide here, the different core principles that address these 3 elements of the journey. The operational guidance then provides specific and practical detail on how the core principles are put into practice by different types of companies and other actors. And in the middle of the slide here, you can see the different operational guidance documents, all of which are available on the AFI website right now for consultation and input. And finally, terms and definitions support both the core principles and operational guidance. In the subsequent slides, Akiva and I will present the framework in summary form, topic by topic, And as we do so, we'll highlight some of the most salient content in both the core principles and the operational guidance. Akiva, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, so I'll take the first set of principles, and then I'll turn it to Jeff to talk about the next set. So just for your information, as you follow along, in each of the following slides, we will present key elements of the framework for each topic, which are covered in both the core principles and the operational guidance. The title headings of the slides reference the respective core principle, while the related documents that you'll see listed in the sidebar in the next slides will identify which sections of the operational guidance address the topic. So the first core principle, unsurprisingly, is that companies commit to eliminating deforestation from their supply chains. And the second principle is that companies commit to eliminating conversion of other natural ecosystems from their supply chains besides forests. For a commitment to enable accountability, it specifies both a target date by which the commitment will be met and a cutoff date after which land units associated with deforestation or conversion are deemed non-compliant with the commitment. So let me give you an example of the specific guidance that fleshes out these core principles using the topic of cutoff dates. In a case where a sector-wide cutoff date exists, say for all beef producers within a certain region, the guidance states that new company commitments should align with this cutoff date. That's preferable than setting an individual cutoff date. And where a sector-wide cutoff date doesn't currently exist, the date that a company sets should be no later than the publication of the supply chain commitment if we're before 2020, or no later than January 1st, 2020, if the supply chain commitment is published after 2020. So that's an example of how the operational guidance specifies the core principles. Next slide, please. We don't have time to go through the 70 or 80 common definitions provided in the guidance, but here are a few of the critical ones. Deforestation is defined as the loss of natural forests as a result of conversion to agriculture or other non-forest land use, conversion to a plantation, or severe or sustained degradation. And note that natural forests is the operative concept for deforestation in the context of supply chains, which is the focus of AFI. Deforestation-free, then, is defined as commodity production, sourcing, or financial investments that do not cause or contribute to deforestation. And note also that AFI specifies no gross deforestation or zero deforestation rather than a no net deforestation definition as the appropriate goal for companies to be pursuing. Conversion is defined as a change of a natural ecosystem, so note that that parallels natural forests, change of a natural ecosystem to another land use or profound change in the natural ecosystem's species composition, structure, or function. And conversion-free then is defined as commodity production, sourcing, or financial investments that don't cause or contribute to conversion. Next, please. It's probably helpful to go through a couple of frequently asked questions regarding AFI's definitions. So regarding the relationship between accountability framework definitions and localized definitions, AFI's position is that recognized definitions that have been developed in regional, sectoral, or in context-specific cases should be used where they are compatible with key elements of AFI's definitions. AFI's generic definitions are available when other legitimate definitions are absent, contradictory, or unclear. As for which existing frameworks are compatible with AFI's deforestation-free guidelines, there are many, including the CGF's Deforestation Resolution, the New York Declaration on Forest and the SDGs, and certifications like FSC and RTRS. I'll also note that the definition of forests used by AFI and the FAO are compatible, but AFI focuses only on natural forests and not plantations. The operational guidance is very helpful here because it goes through a range of real-world scenarios and weighs in on whether conversion of certain sites would be compatible with deforestation or conversion-free commitments, including boundary cases that pose some ambiguity. Next, please. The next core principle is that companies respect the full range of rights of indigenous people and local communities that are implicated by commodity production, trade, and finance. Part of that is ensuring the free, prior, and informed consent is secured before any activity that might affect these rights, and providing remediation or compensation whenever rights have been violated. A related core principle is that company activities respect workers' rights, including no child or forced labor, freedom of association and collective bargaining, no discrimination or abusive practices, living wages and fair benefits, and the right to a safe and healthy workplace. Next slide. The operational guidance related to these core principles discusses the allocation of responsibilities in the rights context. Producers and companies occupying an upstream position in the supply chain will typically have the greatest direct responsibility for engaging with indigenous people and local communities around activities that might affect their rights, but downstream companies also have responsibility for impacts to these rights that occur within the company's supply chains. In this regard, downstream companies are expected to understand the level of performance of their suppliers around respecting indigenous and local rights, and should take action to help ensure that rights are respected. Next, please. The next set of core principles relates to the specification of commitments. The first principle is that commitments are scoped to apply broadly to a company's own operations, as well as to its sourcing and financing activities. Second, commitments incorporate public targets and milestones that specify completion dates. Third, commitments use common terminology and definitions so that progress on commitments can be more readily assessed. And fourth, companies comply with applicable laws and meet the highest standard when there are discrepancies between voluntary commitments and applicable law. And again, here, the operational guidance elaborates options that are available if the highest standard and applicable law are in conflict with one another. So I'll now hand it off to Jeff to talk through the other core principles that relate to implementation of commitments.
Thanks very much, Akiva. So Akiva has just laid out the guidance provided by the accountability framework on what constitutes a strong company commitment within the topical scope of the framework. And now I'll be speaking about what actually needs to be done for these commitments to be considered to have been fulfilled and for this progress to be credibly demonstrated. So the next set of principles really relates to the tagline for our initiative, delivering on ethical supply chain commitments, which of course is what we hope will happen to drive improvements in social and environmental conditions on the ground. So the first core principle around implementation and taking action has to do with the establishment of company systems and processes to drive effective implementation. This includes things like adequate senior level commitment and accountability to the commitment and its fulfillment, as well as incorporation of the commitment into the company's internal decision-making processes, incentives, and procedures. It also includes making sure the companies guard against providing financing or other forms of support to suppliers that are engaged in deforestation, conversion, or human rights violations. The second core principle addresses risk assessment, supply chain mapping, and traceability. This core principle and the associated guidance helps to answer a common question that companies ask and deal with, which is how much traceability is enough? And the answer to that is actually quite simple at a principle level, which is that supply chain materials need to
Jeff, we lost you.
Let me back up for just a moment. It seems like the audio may have cut out. So core principle 2 has to do with risk assessment, supply chain mapping, and traceability. And this principle and the associated guidance asks the common question that companies ask, how much traceability is needed within their supply chain? The framework indicates that supply chain materials need to be known or controlled sufficiently to ascertain compliance or to assess the extent and nature of non-compliances that need to be addressed. So primary processors and first-level traders are expected to know the origin of raw materials back to the production units of origin, whereas manufacturers and retailers that sit further downstream in supply chains should be able to verify compliance or assess non-compliance through one of 4 different options. One is that they themselves can trace
Sorry, Jeff, I think you cut out again when you started describing the 4 options.
Oh, okay. Adrian and Sally, are you also having trouble hearing me?
Yes, Jeff, it was the same. It cut out on our end as well.
Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. Akiva, maybe I could ask you to carry on with these slides while I...
Okay, Jeff, you cut out while you were asking me to carry on, but I will, and then I'll check in with you to see if you've gotten a better audio connection. So just to finish up on this slide, the four options for carrying out traceability include tracing back to the original producer of the commodity in the supply chain. Second, tracing back to a supplier that itself has a control system that is able to ensure that its supplies are traced to origin. And then that supplier would have to be able to demonstrate to the buyer that this control system is in place and is doing what it needs to. The third option is using certification from a credible scheme that has effective traceability built in. And the fourth option is to trace supplies to a jurisdiction that has low risk at the jurisdictional level of deforestation or conversion and low risk of adverse social impacts. Jeff, are you back with us or should I keep going?
I can hear you, Akiva. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Are you able to?
Yes, can hear you. Go ahead, Jeff.
All right. I was looking into dial-in options, but I think if I do that, I would be a participant only. So let me know if the audio challenges persist, and I'll pass the baton to you. The third principle has to do with managing supply chain compliance. So for companies that purchase commodities from multiple suppliers, these companies are expected to manage their entire supply chain to fulfill commitments, to identify non-compliance, and to resolve such issues expeditiously and effectively. A key question that comes up in practice is when commodity buyers should retain versus exclude non-compliant suppliers. The AFI's default approach is that buyers should continue to engage with non-compliant suppliers to drive time-bound improvements. And this is a way of actually addressing the social and environmental issues on the ground. However, in certain cases, suspension or exclusion is indicated. And the framework provides a rubric and decision tree on when this would be based on the severity, extent, and persistence of the non-compliance, the supplier's degree of culpability, and whether the supplier is committed and has the capability to resolve outstanding issues. When non-compliant suppliers are retained pending the resolution of non-compliance, it's also important for buyers to engage with them and in some cases to support them to achieve time-bound progress toward compliance. The next two principles have to do with action that's actually taken on the ground within production units and processing facilities where commodities are produced. So core principle 4 addresses land acquisition, land use planning, and site development, and specifies that before a company develops land or acquires interest in land, that it conducts or supports a proper participatory assessment and land use planning process that would include local communities and indigenous peoples as appropriate. This is a way of making sure that commodity production is compliant with company commitments from its initial inception with respect to both environmental and human rights issues. Core Principle 5 then addresses effective land management and long-term protection once a commodity producing or processing site has been established. This principle and the associated guidance helps clarify what companies need to do to make sure that land areas such as forests and other natural ecosystems are actually protected on a long-term basis. And this may require supporting local communities or helping to put in place or support local governance activities that may involve other stakeholders as well. It's important to note that there is a differentiation of responsibility for these actions along the value chain. Companies that own or manage production areas are most directly responsible for applying these principles, but downstream companies also need to ensure that they're carried out and to provide support as needed. Principle 6 addresses remediation, restoration, and access to remedy in the event that companies have not fulfilled their commitments or where they've caused or contributed to adverse impacts. In these cases, companies are expected to provide for or cooperate in the remediation of these harms. The establishment of an effective grievance mechanism and the use of existing grievance mechanisms is one important way to make sure that such harms are identified and properly remediated. In addition, the framework provides guidance on how companies can conduct or support restoration or compensation in the event that deforestation or conversion has occurred, which in many cases can enable producers to re-enter responsible supply chains once these activities have been undertaken. Finally, the framework works to help ensure that there are not orphan social and environmental impacts on the ground for whom there's no responsible party. So when a company is acquiring interest in land or natural resources, such as a new farm, plantation, or timber concession, the default is that they would assume responsibility to remediate past harms, unless that responsibility is explicitly retained or transferred to a different party. Core Principle 7 recognizes that in order to properly address deforestation, conversion, and human rights issues, may sometimes require working beyond the direct production or sourcing footprint of a supply chain company, and may also require working with other actors. This principle calls upon companies to properly engage stakeholders related to their supply chain commitments, including engaging beyond their immediate footprint or supply chain. This might include, for instance, contributing to landscape or jurisdictional initiatives, working with governments and peer companies on topics such as mapping and monitoring, improved land governance, law enforcement, information sharing, and other topics. Finally, companies are asked to conduct their business and use their influence in a way that helps protect the environment and human rights. For instance, so that their political and advocacy activities are in line with the commitments that they've made on these topics. The topic of smallholder inclusion in responsible supply chains is a very important one. It's a cross-cutting theme that's addressed in many sections of the accountability framework. The AFI seeks to facilitate smallholder inclusion in responsible supply chains, and this is recognized as an important way to help support the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of smallholders around the world, while increasing crop productivity, avoiding the displacement of deforestation and human rights impacts, and ensuring stable commodity supplies. The framework specifies and clarifies the important role that smallholder groups can play in helping to organize smallholders and enable them to participate in responsible supply chains. So the framework identifies the characteristics of effective groups and clarifies roles that companies can play in helping to establish or support these groups. The guidance also provides nuanced direction on both traceability and management of non-compliance in a smallholder context, recognizing that the conditions and constraints for smallholders are somewhat different than they are for large-scale producers. Finally, for companies that are making progress toward fulfilling their commitment, being able to credibly demonstrate and communicate this progress is very important. And for the global community looking to track progress and drive accountability, monitoring, verification, and reporting are likewise very important. The last two core principles address these aspects of how progress is assessed and demonstrated. The framework calls upon companies to conduct regular monitoring of commitments relative to specific time-bound targets, and also to validate this monitoring information through independent verification. Monitoring and verification focuses on social and environmental outcomes associated with product origins at the production unit and at the primary processing level. Monitoring and verification should not only assess compliance with commitments in a binary way, but also be able to track incremental progress that is made over time. Monitoring and verification by upstream companies that are closer to the ground is meant to focus on actual conditions on the ground, whereas companies further downstream that are not directly monitoring field conditions would be assessing performance based on data provided by their suppliers, and also monitoring the effectiveness of their suppliers' own internal systems for assessing and driving greater progress. The accountability framework provides a set of metrics, common definitions, and recognized methods to clarify what types of monitoring and verification are considered credible and effective for both environmental and human rights topics. The framework does recognize that some existing control systems, such as some certification programs, already include many of these functions and can partially or fully fulfill monitoring and verification expectations. And finally, the framework specifies the level and type of third-party verification that would be expected in order to validate compliance and substantiate company claims. The final principle is around reporting, disclosure, and claims. The framework suggests that companies should be reporting progress at least annually. The report should be using common definitions and good practices for conveying precise and verifiable information so that reporting data is actually clear and meaningful. Use of existing reporting standards can help, but is not entirely comprehensive. So the AFI suggests some additional reporting elements and metrics that companies can use. Finally, the framework suggests that companies should disclose information on their suppliers, supply origins, and non-compliances. And this can help improve transparency, for instance, in monitoring forest areas and high conservation areas that have been set aside within production landscapes. Finally, the AFI is working very closely with a variety of leading reporting initiatives and standards to help align the metrics and guidelines by which progress is assessed, so that over time we can move toward much stronger accountability at the level of individual companies and across entire sectors and globally. So just as a recap, all of the material, all of the guidance that I've just presented is meant to be applied by companies in setting and fulfilling their ethical supply chain commitments, following the ethical supply chain journey that I described earlier. The framework is also intended to be used by a variety of other actors, including companies, service providers, government, producers, and those affected by commodity production within production landscapes, monitoring, verification, and accountability initiatives, as I just mentioned, as well as other sustainable commodity initiatives and standards, such as certification systems and sector initiatives that can use the framework as a common reference point for alignment and development of these tools to conform with existing global norms that the accountability framework reflects. Now, before turning the webinar over to questions and discussion, I'd just like to briefly summarize the consultation process. As Akiva mentioned at the beginning, we are in the third and final consultation period for the draft accountability framework. This period continues until March 4th. We actively welcome comments and suggestions on the draft framework through this time. Please visit our website to access all of the framework documents. And there's online forms that you can use to submit comments topic by topic. We also certainly encourage you to subscribe to our newsletters, which will enable you to keep up to date on the progress of the AFI and receive announcements on any new document releases, events, and other news as that happens. And you can follow us on Twitter as well. As part of the consultation period up through March 4th, in addition to this webinar and other conversations, we're conducting a series of consultation events within tropical commodity producing regions across Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. And we're also holding events for companies and for NGOs and engaging in a variety of other consultation modalities. And again, for those of you who are not able to participate in one of these events, please make use of the online consultation platform available at our website, accountability-framework.org. And with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation and open it up for any questions or comments that folks would like to make. And I'm going to ask Adrian to read the questions off of the chat box, I think. And in recognition of the limited time that we have here, If you have a question and we weren't able to answer it in the available time, if you do put it in the chat box, in the question box, we'll record it and subsequently we'll post the questions anonymized as well as responses on the AFI website. So Adrian, let me pass it back to you. I think we also can make use of the hand raising function if people would like to verbalize their questions instead of putting them in writing.
Yes, indeed. Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question directly to the full group. But let's dive into a few that we've gotten so far already. First, I think we'd like to pass by a few points that we were asked to clarify. So, for example, could we clarify, please, Jeff, what the AFI's guidance says about applicable law and exactly what companies should do when AFI principles are at odds with local laws?
Thanks, Adrian. I think I may ask Akiva to speak to that if you'd like to.
Yes, happy to. And without looking at the guidance while I'm responding, I won't try to give full treatment, but basically it provides a couple of options. So one option would be if there's, again, a conflict between applicable law and the highest standard, which might be represented by a company's voluntary commitment. One option would be for the company to request guidance from the government on potential ways to comply both with the law and with its own voluntary commitment. A company could also request waivers from the government to allow the company to abstain from legal compliance in this individual case. And another option, of course, is a company could choose to suspend operations if they already have operations that are ongoing that could be threatened by the need to comply with this law that would undermine the environmental or social objectives of the company. Or if the company doesn't already have operations ongoing, it could choose to avoid pursuing business operations in that location so long as the law prohibits the company from doing what it needs to meet its environmental and social objectives.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that and maybe start one level higher up, the fundamental principle within the accountability framework is that voluntary commitments are in addition to compliance with law. So the accountability framework is fundamentally saying that companies need to comply with applicable law in addition to their voluntary commitments, and that the higher standard would prevail. So the comments that Akiva was making would be in cases where compliance with law might actually cause the company not to be able to meet its commitment. If, for instance, law indicates that a company, for instance, a concession holder is obliged to develop an area of land that's currently forest, and that would violate the company's deforestation-free commitment. In those cases, the options that Akiva mentioned would come into play, and we would encourage the company to pursue one of those options so that they could both meet their commitment and still comply with government mandates or with the specific interpretation that the government has provided in that case to enable the company to also meet its commitment.
Great, thanks for that both, and I hope that answered the question. It seems like it would be very helpful as well, Jeff and Akiva, to speak a little bit more about the multi-stakeholder nature of the consultations we've had so far on the framework. To reiterate that while the Accountability Framework Steering Group is indeed a coalition of civil society and is so because we are striving to achieve consensus amongst our members around these issues, that many of our consultations and the contributions to developing the content that you currently see as part of the draft framework has been very multi-stakeholder. And perhaps in line with that, also speak about how we're working with the various reporting and disclosure initiatives and other tools and systems.
Sure, Adrian, thanks very much. And I think you actually summarized the response to the first question quite well. So even though the Accountability Framework Initiative is run by a coalition of civil society organizations, in the process of developing the framework, our objective has been to consolidate and align best practice around the setting, implementation, and monitoring of commitments. So in that regard, it's quite important to understand both the progress and the innovations being made by the private sector and by government in addressing these issues, but also the practicalities, challenges, and limitations that these other stakeholders face in actually trying to translate commitments into action and results. So in that regard, we consider that the framework has been heavily inputted, even in some cases co-created with these additional stakeholders. And you can see on the screen here some of the events we've been holding recently to continue that process, which began earlier. With respect to, oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, didn't mean to cut you off. I just thought I'd add a little bit of sort of personal flavor to make this a bit more real for folks. WEF has been working for many years, as have other members of the steering group of AFI, with companies to set and implement deforestation-free commitments. And it became clear around the time that AFI decided to get going that companies were having difficulty with the various guidance that they were getting from different parts of the civil society sector. And so really the impetus to create AFI was to provide some harmony among the various actors who've been advising companies on how to do deforestation-free supply chains properly. And so AFI decided to form to create as robust and as credible a set of guidance as we could. And that informs the reason of why we decided to go with an all civil society steering group, but deciding to balance it very much the way that Jeff explained, with very close collaboration and co-creation with the private sector to make sure that we were taking the best of practice from company experience and also paying close heed to the feasibility of what companies could and could not do in creating our guidance.
Thanks, Akiva. And let me try to speak to the second part of the question about the work that the AFI is doing with other reporting and assessment initiatives. So a question that we commonly get is, will the AFI be conducting its own assessment or rating of companies and their performance? Will we be putting out a scorecard? And the answer to that is no. That's not something that the AFI is planning to do. And the main reason why is that we recognize that there are already many initiatives out there that are doing this in one form or another. And many of them are doing quite good work. So there are already reporting standards and reporting platforms such as CDP Forest. There are assessment initiatives and scorecards by groups like Supply Chain and Spot and several others. So rather than develop yet another assessment and scorecarding initiative, the AFI has chosen to partner with these types of organizations and look at ways that the accountability framework as a guide for what constitutes effective setting, implementation, and monitoring of commitments, how those elements can be translated into common metrics that can then be applied across the whole array of initiatives that are seeking to track progress and drive accountability. And ultimately, when there's clarity on the metrics and indicators of progress, and that clarity is carried across all of the actors in the system, then companies know what those elements are. They can take decisions on that basis. And that's also the way that progress is assessed. And we think that over time, that can provide really a much clearer signal and much clearer information about what level of progress we're making. Then we focus on solving the problem rather than debating what good looks like.
Great. Well, we have lots more excellent questions here. Another one is around recognition that companies have varying models for engagement with their suppliers depending on the volumes and availability and importance of the supply that they provide for that particular company's business. And so the question is, does the accountability framework's recommendations around engaging non-compliant suppliers provide room for business models that rely on spot purchase relationships with suppliers, or does the accountability framework expect companies to change the nature of the relationships that they have with suppliers? I think this really gets at our guidance in core principles 2 and maybe a bit in 3. So I'll pass it over to you, Jeff, to answer that, and Akiva.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll maybe make a few first comments and then see if Akiva would like to add on to that. So that's a great question. And I think the accountability framework brings a couple of perspectives on that. The first is that is that we're looking to make progress on these issues very quickly. So we need to find ways to work within the structure of commodity markets as they now exist. And spot trading is a major feature in many sectors. But the second is that over time, if we want effective management of social and environmental risk to be properly systematized, that we may over time begin to see some changes in how commodity markets are structured. Indeed, this has already happened, begun to happen to some extent. So I put back up the core principle 2 here on risk assessment, supply chain mapping, and traceability. And I draw your attention especially to the bottom of the slide, where the framework identifies 4 options that companies that are purchasing commodities can pursue in order to have an adequate level of control over their supply. So in a spot trading context, a purchaser could be relying on the party that it's purchasing from to have a control system in place to make sure that its supplies are properly controlled, which means traceability and also assessment of compliance. If that system is in place, then the purchaser is at liberty to purchase that product, knowing that it meets commitments, or at least that the nature of compliance is specified by that supplier. Another option that many people are actively pursuing and that holds a lot of promise is jurisdictional approaches, whereby a given jurisdiction, subnational unit like a district or municipality, is sufficiently able to manage particular risk issues such that the product coming from that jurisdiction can be considered low enough risk that it effectively fulfills the commitment. This is also another way of facilitating spot trading or fluidity in commodity markets to enable commitments to be fulfilled without having to have direct knowledge back to the individual production unit of origin. So certainly this is a very complicated issue that the accountability framework seeks to provide a common and generalizable set of principles that can then be used in different commodity and sourcing contexts. Akiva, did you want to add any comments on this point?
I'll just very quickly reinforce that from AFI's perspective, there's nothing inherently wrong with spot trading. It introduces some obscurity to the traceability of the commodity, which has to be addressed. So long as that traceability can be brought into the system, and the risk of a lack of traceability can be mitigated through one of the tracing methodologies that Jeff outlined, then again, there's nothing wrong with spot trading inherently.
Great, thank you both. We have a few more questions too about the engagement with companies and plans moving forward, and what other types of materials the accountability framework may make available for those who plan to use and implement it. So I can start to answer this question, then Jeff and Akiva, pass to you to see if you'd like to add. So one of the questions specifically is around whether or not we plan to complement the framework with some case studies. The answer to that is yes. We're in the process of developing some of those right now. Another question is around how we're working with companies on this in terms of testing and applying the guidance in the framework. The answer to that is that we are in the process. As Akiva mentioned in the introduction, we've been conducting bilateral consultations with companies, as well as group consultations with different industry associations and groups. And so through those, we've gotten a lot of feedback on the framework that we've been incorporating, but also through some of the bilateral consultations, we're starting to really look at the details of the guidance and how those might be applied by the various teams within the companies. And so that's an ongoing process that we're in right now. And that should give us a lot of information about how the framework will be applied in practice, as to whether there are any need for additional guidance to fill any gaps that still exist. And then to answer another question in here, we are working with companies both upstream and downstream in the supply chain through those processes. So when Jeff had the slide up that showed you the different consultations that we're holding in the various countries and regions, through those consultation processes as well, there will be sort of an ongoing engagement with companies who are suppliers or producing companies in those regions, so that we can gather strong information about the application implementation of guidance at that point along the supply chain. And then we have a very similar process ongoing with a handful of companies, also the multinationals at the global level as well. So we hope that through that process, it will be really a very iterative and learning, I think, process and experience for everyone involved as to how this framework will be rolled out and applied by companies. And then, of course, how the various links that Jeff and Akiva referred to with the different reporting initiatives and other systems that the framework's aligning with, how we can also further strengthen any of that alignment as needed. And then finally, there's a question also related to this around how the framework links to the Sustainable Development Goals, recognizing that many companies are using them as an M&E benchmark. We are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and recognize that companies are using those. And of course, the framework in terms of recognizing and addressing deforestation-free supply chain commitments is aligned with many of the goals, as well as the various guidance we have around human rights and labor rights now as well. We are also working with the New York Declaration on Forests platform, which is hosted by UNDP, and we'll continue working with them throughout this year. And as the different metrics are developed around that match our monitoring and verification guidance, we will also be working with them to look at how the framework can help serve as a guiding resource for implementation of the New York Declaration as well. So I'll stop there. That was a nice group of questions, I think, that get at some really key points about the framework's development, our consultation and plans moving forward. So Jeff and Akiva, I'd just like to see if you'd like to add anything to that.
Nothing from my side, Adrian. Thank you. That was very efficient in responding to all of those questions. Since we're nearly out of time here, I just wanted to reiterate the invitation. If folks have any additional questions or comments they'd like to provide at this time, please feel free to use the chat feature in the webinar to submit your question or comment, and we will respond to those in writing on the AFI website. And we'll also post the recording for this webinar for anyone who wants to pass it on to colleagues. And again, just as a reminder, the online platform is available to review the draft documents and provide feedback online. The consultation period runs until Monday, March 4th. So yeah, Akiva, I don't know if you have any final words as well that you'd like to share.
Just the last word is just to reinforce that we really are going to be taking these inputs very seriously. We have a full month or more devoted to incorporating the comments that we get during this consultation period, and we want to shape the final guidance documents before we launch them with all of your inputs. So really, really encourage you to take advantage of the website to do that.
Great, thank you very much, Akiva and Adrian. Thanks to all of you for your time and interest in the AFI and for participating in this webinar, for all the questions. We hope it's been helpful, and we look forward to your input or further participation in the initiative. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.